It's fair to say that with the release of Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty, the comeback story will be practically complete. Cyberpunk 2077 joins the ranks of No Man's Sky and Final Fantasy XIV as a byword for a game that launched in flames and needed a colossal apology tour to make things right. Even with the huge 2.0 update that was released alongside Phantom Liberty, Cyberpunk 2077 is still not what many players had hoped it would be when the game was first released. However, this DLC, which doubles as a farewell to the game as developer CD Projekt Red moves on to a full sequel, serves as not only a make good for the mistakes of the past, but the best content that's ever taken place on the streets of Night City. Phantom Liberty takes place in Dogtown, a new area of Night City previously unexplorable in the main game. Dogtown is littered with shanty towns and opulent buildings falling to pieces, and crucially, just as V arrives, the President of the new United States crashing down to Earth. Encouraged by a mysterious figure, V finds themselves entangled in a web of intrigue with FIA agent Solomon Reed, played by Idris Elba. This is just one way in which Phantom Liberty deals in the Hollywood spectacle. There's a real bells and whistles feel to the main thrust of missions, which when we played in sequential order, could easily rank as one of the strongest single-player experiences of the year. Dogtown itself flew past us as we pursued the main narrative thread, an issue that the game seems to acknowledge with a clunky roadblock that forces you to engage with less than sparkling side jobs. Missions are varied not only in their activity but also in their pacing. There are several missions in which not one shot is fired and the spy thriller espionage vibes are turned all the way up. These are the absolute highlights of Phantom Liberty and an element of the game we wished was explored further. That's actually a theme of the DLC, mechanics that are suddenly introduced and then dropped seemingly just as quickly. It feels like there's scope for a much longer expansion here, but on the other hand, the relatively short length means that Phantom Liberty never outstays its welcome. It's a box set you finish in a weekend and want more of, rather than a turgid grind with a few highlights. However, this does mean some whiplash between the missions when you're doing the rather boring base Cyberpunk style shooting gallery missions and Cyberpunk Phantom Liberty's neon James Bond capers. Speaking of the base game, notable by his relative absence is Johnny Silverhand. Relegated to more of a jump scare when he appears rather than a reoccurring annoyance, his input is much more measured in Phantom Liberty. The rest of the cast is enjoyable, even if Idris Elba's American accent takes a transatlantic holiday every so often. The overall narrative of Phantom Liberty is far stronger than that of the base game of Cyberpunk 2077, and although there are a few twists and turns that are heavily telegraphed, the process of getting to those twists and turns was always enjoyable. Even characters that only appear for a mission or two are far more memorable than those that were found in the original. A couple of bougie French netrunners that encounter via a roulette table are a particular highlight. Dogtown isn't massively memorable as an open world environment, but the new interiors that Phantom Liberty introduces are very strong. Not only are they visually interesting spaces to inhabit, but much like the main game, they look absolutely incredible. The game is still such a visual showpiece on PC, and we ran into very few technical issues running the game on ultra ray tracing mode, outside of some screen tearing when moving from very dark areas to very bright ones. While it's not tied to the DLC itself, the massive 2.0 update that releases alongside Phantom Liberty is one of the most transformative we've seen a single player RPG ever receive. Not only is there a sense that this update made sure to cover every nitpick that fans had at launch, but smart changes like divorcing the clothes you wear from your armor stat, a totally revamped skill tree, and an abundance of ways to spec your character make this 2.0 update feel almost sequel-like in its changes to Cyberpunk's formula. There are obviously limits to how much this can manifest in-game, as you can only change so much about the nuts and bolts of how Cyberpunk works, as CD Projekt seemingly acknowledges but in this farewell piece of content, but the 2.0 update is the best incentive to give Cyberpunk 2077 another try that the studio has ever offered up. Pair that with a pulpy spy thriller full of excellent set pieces and strong characters, and Phantom Liberty is Cyberpunk 2077 at its most well realised. There's an element of sadness to it thinking about what could have been if the main game was up to quite the standard of Phantom Liberty, but at the very least it means CD Projekt can move on to its next project safe in the knowledge that Cyberpunk 2077 wasn't abandoned. Although it'll likely never have the post-Witcher 3 goodwill it once had, it's mostly turned the ship around. Just how much goodwill Cyberpunk 2077 had to make up to each individual player is different, especially when you consider the extreme differences in experiences that PC players and console players got at launch. And while there's nothing that Phantom Liberty could have done to make up to those console players who received a broken game at launch after a decade of hype, it does at least sail much closer to the game that was promised all those years ago, even if, after all these updates, there are still some foundational problems with Night City that this expansion can't shake. We give Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty 4 out of 5.